Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm honored to welcome you to today's webinar, Better Trials, Better Treatments for Alzheimer's, and of course, partnering with USC. My name is Robert May, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kensington and Assisted Living Community in Redondo Beach, California. We look forward to learning additional information today on the exciting world of clinical trials and feedback from participants. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are first. So Kensington Senior Living was founded in 2010. Our leadership team has over 30 years of experiencing developing and operating premier senior living residences in the United States and abroad. We understand the difficult decision in placing a loved one into a senior retirement community. The Kensington promise is simple yet profound: to love and care for your family as we do our own. Is core to the belief that no aspect of caregiving is more important than our partnership with our residents and their families at every stage of aging. We have two communities in Southern California, one in Redondo Beach and another in Sierra Madre. In addition, we have a dedicated memory care community in Redwood City. We at the Kensington provide exceptional assisted living and extraordinary memory care solutions for our families. We have two neighborhoods in memory care. One is called Connections and the other Haven. Connections is for early onset cognitive impairment, and Haven specializes in supporting advanced cognitive decline. These are two unique settings that support our residents through different journeys. Today, we are grateful to have Sandra Maas as our moderator for today's event. Let me tell you a little bit about Sandra. She is a veteran broadcast journalist and medical reporter who spent the last 3 decades interviewing top researchers and scientists, from Dr. Jonas Salk to famed baby Dr. Benjamin Spock. Now working as a board member and journalist for the Women's Museum of California, Sandra shares the stories of women at the top of their game in her video series called Trailblazing Women. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here today. My affiliation with USC has to do with both of my children. They graduated recently from the Viterbi School and also from the Marshall School of Business. And so I have a great affiliation with the University of Southern California, and I partnered with ATRI and Keck before. So I'm thrilled to be here today to learn the latest in treatments for Alzheimer's disease and clinical trials as well. So thank you so much for joining us. As a journalist, I have been covering Alzheimer's disease since the mid-'80s. And I remember researchers told me way back then that we will have a cure for Alzheimer's disease in the next decade. Well, here we are more than 20 years later, still looking for that cure, but there is a lot to be hopeful about. And I think that you will get some great information today from our two expert speakers who will be talking about better trials and treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Michael Raffi and Sarah Walter will be speaking to us, each for about 15 minutes. And then after that, we will be opening it up to questions, a Q&A session. So if during any time during this presentation you have a question, you will see at the bottom of your screen, you can go ahead and just type in under the Q&A section your question, and we will address it and get to it at the end of the program. So let's get things started right now. I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Michael Raffi. He is a board-certified neurologist and associate professor of clinical neurology at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. He is also medical director of Alzheimer's Therapeutic Research Institute, also known as ATRI, and the NIH-funded Alzheimer's Clinical Trial Consortium, where he oversees safety across all clinical trials. He received his MD and PhD degrees from Brown University School of Medicine and conducted neurogenetics research at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Raffi completed his neurology residency at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, where he also served as chief resident. He then completed a fellowship in dementia at UC San Diego. Dr. Raffi, we are thrilled to have you joining us this afternoon. You will be sharing an overview of the Alzheimer's Therapeutic Research Institute and how people that are watching today and their loved ones might benefit the most from these clinical trials. So welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm going to give you an update on Alzheimer's disease, what we understand about it, and what are we doing about it. So I work at the Alzheimer's Therapeutic Research Institute. This is an institute based in San Diego. We have 7 faculty members and about 160 staff members. We have a single mission, and that is to accelerate the development of effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease. I've listed here a number of our activities, including developing infrastructure to conduct clinical trials, to improve methods, the designs, the analyses, and the types of biomarkers or biochemical markers that we use to study the disease. We run observational studies looking at the natural history of Alzheimer's disease in the general population. We also conduct a number of clinical trials. Some of these are academic, some of them are with pharmaceutical partnerships, and some of them are public-private partnerships where it's a combination of academics and companies. We also have an interest in adults with Down syndrome. Everyone with Down syndrome is at a very high risk of developing a genetic form of Alzheimer's disease. And we also work on improving diversity and inclusion, both in our own faculty and staff, but also in study participants, and we share our methods and data widely. This is a slide that just displays the 3 leaders of the Alzheimer's Clinical Trials Consortium, or ACTC. This is a very large grant that is administered by ATRI and in conjunction with 2 other universities. So Dr. Paul Azen at USC, Dr. Risa Sperling at the Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard, and Dr. Ronald Peterson at the Mayo Clinic. These 3 individuals are the principal investigators of this very large network that conducts clinical trials across 35 clinical trial sites that are steering committee sites, as well as another 100 clinical trial sites that are affiliated sites. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about what our understanding is of Alzheimer's disease. And first, I just want to take a step back and talk about, as a neurologist, what we spend our time thinking about when we're trying to understand Alzheimer's disease. And so what I would like to begin with is talking about the 5 cognitive domains, the 5 areas of thinking that make us who we are. These include memory, language, visual spatial relations, problem solving, and attention. And we know that different parts of the brain carry out each of these activities and abilities, and all 5 of these work together in harmony to help us carry out our daily lives. Interestingly, one of these cognitive domains changes as we age. The memory of a 5-year-old is very different than the memory of a 25-year-old, which is very different than the memory functioning of a 75-year-old. And the other cognitive abilities remain essentially unchanged, but memory changes dramatically. Now, one question that patients ask when they come into the clinic is, well, what is wrong with my memory? I've noticed that it's changed. Is this Alzheimer's disease? And so what is normal memory change and what is not? And here I have a slide showing you a study that was published a number of years ago, looking at the most common memory complaints of healthy older adults, folks over the age of 65. This study involved thousands of participants, and you will see that over 80% of people over the age of 65 have trouble recalling names and words, and more than half have trouble remembering where they place things. Almost half have difficulty knowing that they told someone something and may repeat it. And forgetting a task after starting it and losing the thread of a conversation are also very common complaints. These are very common, but they do not always indicate Alzheimer's disease. Now, one does not develop Alzheimer's disease overnight. there is a stage between this normal age-related memory changes and dementia. And this stage is referred to as the mild cognitive impairment syndrome, or MCI. And it is a diagnostic classification. Physicians can make this diagnosis. It involves someone saying, "Doc, there's something wrong with my memory." So a subjective complaint of memory. But beyond that, there also needs to be an objective memory impairment measured by some sort of a memory test that's adjusted for that person's age and education. Other than that, all those other cognitive domains that I mentioned earlier are intact. Now, in the early 2000s, Dr. Ron Peterson, who I mentioned earlier as one of the PIs of the ACTC, looked at over 500 folks over the age of 65 who had complaints about memory and fit that criteria of mild cognitive impairment. In fact, he coined the term mild cognitive impairment. And those are the individuals who are on the purple line. And then he had another group of people who did not have any complaints of their memory. And he followed these individuals over 5 years. And on the bottom, on the x-axis, you can see the number of years. And then on the y-axis, up and down, is the percentage of folks who did not have dementia. And what you'll see is that after 5 years, those individuals who are on the MCI line, after 5 years, about half of them had developed dementia. Whereas those on the green line, those who did not have a memory complaint and did not fit the criteria of MCI, they pretty much remained normal. And so this idea of MCI represents a risk factor of someone who may be on the trajectory of developing Alzheimer's disease. But as you can see, only half of them do so after 5 years. Now, dementia is different than mild cognitive impairment. Mild cognitive impairment is memory only, typically a single cognitive domain, usually memory, whereas dementia is memory impairment plus another cognitive domain that's impaired. And here you can see again on the x-axis along the bottom, I have different age ranges, starting between the ages of 61 and 64, going all the way up to 85 to 93. And on the y-axis up and down, I have the prevalence, the percentage of people who have dementia. And the red diamonds represent the percentage of folks who have dementia across each of these age ranges. So you'll see between the ages of 65 and 69, only 3% of people have dementia. But if you look at 85 to 93, that age range, more than a third, 1 out of every 3 people is demented. 1 out of every 3 people over the age of 85 has dementia. And the fastest growing segment of our population in the United States is those people over the age of 85. Now, the number 1 cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. That's shown here in the yellow columns. There are other forms of dementia, Alzheimer's causing about 75% of cases, but there's vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia. But the large bulk of cases are due to Alzheimer's disease. What is Alzheimer's disease? It is a degenerative disorder of the brain. We call it Alzheimer's disease because of the fellow who's pictured on the top right of your screen, Dr. Alois Alzheimer. I had a patient, the patient down below, Augustus Deitch, who had memory complaints when she first presented in his office in Vienna, Austria in 1904. And over a number of years, he followed her in his clinic and she developed dementia. And when she died, he performed an autopsy on her brain and he looked under a microscope. And what he saw, he identified as most likely the reason for her dementia. So what did Dr. Alzheimer see? On the top left here on these figures of the brain, you can see a normal image of the brain, a caricature of the brain, as if you were looking in a mirror. And if you follow the outer part of the brain, which is a bit darker, that area is called the cerebral cortex. In Latin, cerebral cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. And if you follow it to the middle part of the brain, you'll see it has an area called the hippocampus. Now, if you look at the brain in Dr. Alzheimer's patient, and in virtually all other patients with Alzheimer's disease, you'll see the brain is smaller. And if you look for the hippocampus, it is completely gone. The hippocampus, we know, is in charge of memory function. And in Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus is obliterated. It is atrophied or shrunken. And it is for this reason that patients with Alzheimer's disease initially present with memory loss, as in mild cognitive impairment, and then progress over time to develop full-blown dementia. In addition, Dr. Alzheimer's looked under a microscope and he saw in his patient at the bottom right, these brown blobs. These are amyloid plaques, and these plaques are critical and one of the two main biomarkers or pathological features of Alzheimer's disease. For these findings, we call it Alzheimer's disease. However, today we do not need to wait for autopsy to identify someone as having amyloid plaques in the brain. In addition, the other key hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is tau pathology. Amyloid and tau are both proteins that accumulate abnormally in the brain of older adults, particularly those with neurodegenerative diseases. And amyloid and tau are the key hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. If you look at the top row, this is an image with PIB. It's a PET image that allows us to see amyloid in the brain, PIB being a tracer that binds to amyloid. And on the far left, you can see on the top left, you can see an individual who has very little amyloid in the brain, and they were cognitively normal. Red and yellow indicates high levels of amyloid. In the middle and the top, you can see an individual who, again, is cognitively normal, but has a lot of amyloid in their brain. And on the far right, you can see someone who has Alzheimer's disease dementia and even more amyloid throughout the brain. On the bottom is imaging with a PET tracer for tau, looking at tau pathology in the brain. And again, you can see across those different stages of Alzheimer's disease, you can see that there is a greater amount of tau pathology in the symptomatic or the dementia stage of the disease. Using these two techniques, we can now identify folks who may have the hallmarks of Alzheimer's developing in their brain, but may have very little symptoms displaying. And we now understand Alzheimer's disease is a continuum. It does not happen overnight. It takes decades to develop. The first change is amyloid. Here you can see on this graph a depiction of greater abnormality in amyloid in the brain, followed by abnormalities in cognitive performance, and then finally the green line indicating abnormalities in clinical function. And as things become more abnormal, it allows clinicians to make a diagnosis of either preclinical Alzheimer's disease, where the person is asymptomatic but has the pathology in their brain, prodromal Alzheimer's disease, where they may have some mild memory symptoms but not full-blown dementia, and then the final stage, Alzheimer's disease dementia, where they certainly have the abnormal biomarkers, plaques, and tangles, but their clinical function worsens over time. This process of going from being a normal individual with no memory complaints and no memory concerns and developing full-blown dementia is thought to take about 25 years. Similar to someone who may have high cholesterol in their bloodstream and develop heart disease and stroke 15 to 20 years later. We believe that elevated brain amyloid is akin to having elevated cholesterol in the blood, and that early on there are very little symptoms associated with it, but as the disease progresses, it leads to symptoms, in this case, dementia. We have looked at the importance of elevated brain amyloid in a very famous study called the ATRI study. And here we looked at individuals over 10 years who had elevated brain amyloid, those on the orange line, and those who had normal or not elevated brain amyloid. And the x-axis is the number of years we followed these individuals, and the y-axis is a performance measure on a cognitive test, here called the preclinical Alzheimer's cognitive composite. And what you can see is those who had not an elevated brain amyloid level on the blue line, they had some decline, about 2 points on a 40-point scale in their cognition after 10 years. But those who had elevated brain amyloid on average had a 10 to 12 point decline. So a substantial change in their thinking based on the fact that they had amyloid in their brain 10 years earlier. Now, this red arrow here indicates the time where we would like to intervene at the earliest stages before there are any symptoms whatsoever. We believe that early intervention, similar to early intervention for hypercholesterolemia, will help stave off the dementia stages. And so what we have now are a number of clinical trials, including 2 international trials of drugs that are targeting amyloid. These are immunotherapies, drugs that harness the strength of the immune system to target amyloid and remove it or neutralize it in the brain. One of them is called the A4 trial. This is already fully enrolled. It is the anti-amyloid and asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease study with Eli Lilly. This study is fully enrolled and is using an immunotherapy against amyloid. We have just launched a new trial using a different immunotherapy called the AHEAD trial. This uses an antibody that is much more potent in removing amyloid from the brain, and we believe that this trial may be one of our best hopes in preventing Alzheimer's disease dementia. Both of these trials are being conducted in conjunction with the NIH, as well as a pharmaceutical partner. The A4 trial is with Eli Lilly, and the AHEAD trial is with Eisai. Each of those companies are the developers of these immunotherapeutic agents. Both of the trials are designed and led by the USC ATRI with a large number of collaborators. Now, one of the drugs, similar to the ones that I've just mentioned, deserves some comment, and that is a drug called aducanumab. And aducanumab is a drug that's also been studied as an immunotherapy. It is a drug against beta amyloid. And what you can see here are PET scans looking at amyloid in the brain. Again, red means more amyloid. And I have 4 individuals from the top to the bottom who have a lot of amyloid in their brain at baseline. And then 1 year later, those who were either receiving placebo, which is the top row, where you see no change in amyloid, and then those individuals who received different doses of aducanumab. And what you can see is that in all 3 cases, these individuals had a dramatic reduction in amyloid in the brain. And some of the results of these studies that were conducted in over 3,000 individuals indicated that there may be an improvement in cognition over time as compared to placebo. And aducanumab is now being reviewed by the FDA for possible approval this June, which is incredibly exciting for our field and would represent the first new drug for Alzheimer's disease treatment in over 15 years. In fact, there are now 4 amyloid-reducing antibodies in late-stage development. I've already mentioned aducanumab, which is being evaluated by the FDA. I've mentioned the Eisai drug, which is being evaluated in the AHEAD trial, which is ongoing and recruiting. There is gantenerumab, which is also being studied and is administered subcutaneously. And the one that has made the most news recently is another immunotherapy from Eli Lilly called donanemab, which is extremely potent and very impressively reduces amyloid in the brain. All of these drugs reduce amyloid in the brain. They have an accompanying side effect called ARIA, which is an amyloid-related imaging abnormality. This is something to keep in mind. It is an adverse event that we track in all of these cases and all of these clinical trials, but in all of them, it has been managed safely and participants have been able to remain on these drugs for up to 2 years without any significant issues. I just want to mention one last thing, which is that in terms of one's concern about their memory loss and whether it is normal or not normal, and how can they get involved in research, our group, in conjunction with the NIH, has launched a study called the APT web study, the Alzheimer's Prevention Trials web study. This is a study you can log into and consent online, as have 40,000 other individuals, to track your own memory performance and answer some questions about your health. And if there are any changes in your memory, you would be referred to a clinical trial site so that you could participate potentially into a clinical trial to prevent Alzheimer's disease dementia. Again, this trial is for anyone over the age of 50 who has concerns or interests in memory and memory loss and would be able to be evaluated for participation in clinical trials. And this is a photo of our group, our clinical trials group, the ACTC, and down below the ATRI. And I will stop there and thank you for your attention.
Dr. Raffi, that is such exciting news. The fact that there could be the first Alzheimer's drug in 15 years available as early as June. I mean, that's something to really shout out about, isn't it?
Absolutely. We're all very excited about the possibility of being able to prescribe a treatment to prevent Alzheimer's disease dementia or worsening of Alzheimer's disease dementia.
Well, fantastic. Well, keep your questions coming for Dr. Raffi in the Q&A box, and we will continue with the program right now. We're going to meet our second expert. Sarah Walter is with us today, and she is the program administrator for the Alzheimer's Clinical Trials Consortium and for the Alzheimer's Therapeutic Research Institute at the University of Southern California. Sarah's role is to ensure efficient operation of the consortium and to foster collaboration within the research community with external partners and with participants, of course. She draws on her experience across the spectrum of clinical trials, from participant recruitment, conducting assessments, to clinical monitoring, data management, and project and program administration. Sarah serves as the chair for the ACTC Research Participant Advisory Board. Sarah, thanks so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And you are here to show us how to get the most out of being a participant in clinical trials, right?
Thank you, Sandra. That was a lovely introduction. And I just had to comment, when I first started in this field 20 years ago this year, I had a professor, my boss, who said the same thing that you heard back in the 80s, that we were 10 years away from a cure. And I think what that really demonstrates is the level of optimism that researchers really need to have in order to do this work. It's difficult work, it's challenging, it's complex, but it's an incredible group of people, and I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity to work with them, including working with Mike Raffi.
Well, great. We can't wait to hear what you have to say for us today.
Thank you, Sandra. So yeah, I'm going to talk about two ways that we are working to improve trials in Alzheimer's disease. One is integrating participant feedback, and the other is going remote. Make sure I've got the right. Okay. So before I talk about these strategies that we're using, I want to just outline a couple of opportunities and challenges that we're dealing with right now in clinical trials. And Mike Raffi talked about this a little bit already, but I just want to expand on a few of them. First of all, the opportunities are really good and they're really big. So for funding, we've seen over quadruple, funding has quadrupled in the past 10 years. So for example, the 2021 NIH budget is proposed to be $2.8 billion for Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. And that is dedicated to research on care and research for cures. So it's really promising. It's exciting to see. It is, of course, I want to say, only a fraction of what Alzheimer's disease is costing us as a nation in terms of healthcare, what it takes to support and care for somebody with dementia. The cost not only on informal caregivers, the people that aren't paid, that have to quit their jobs to take care of their family members, but also formal care, like in nursing homes or assisted living. So funding's not quite there. It also, for Alzheimer's disease, is just a fraction of what we see funding for cancer and for heart disease. So we know there's room to grow, and we are going to continue to advocate for more and more funding. As Mike mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity in the area of interventions. So there's around 31 drugs being tested right now in phase 3 that's being tested in humans. And 19 of those are disease modifiers. So instead of just addressing the symptoms, like helping you short-term with your memory, it's actually going after what Mike talked about, those hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, the amyloid or the tau. So that's really exciting, and it's a big area of opportunity. We also have incredible diagnostic and research tools now for research. We're able, as Mike shared, to see amyloid in the brain of somebody even before they develop cognitive issues. And we have really sensitive cognitive tests, and that allows us to really measure in people who have totally normal cognition, those very slight changes that are occurring over time. which is a really valuable tool for research and allows us to potentially develop drugs that could actually prevent further cognitive decline if we can pick up those signals of changes early on. We also have blood tests, and this is something that we've been striving for many years. This year has been a big year for blood tests. There's tests now available that measure your amyloid levels that can confirm an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. And there's also potential for blood tests that correlate to the levels of tau in the brain. So again, really huge opportunities. There are some challenges though, and I think this year of COVID has really highlighted some of these, but they're also apparent in Alzheimer's disease research. So in terms of recruitment, only about 1% of the people that are eligible for studies are actually taking part in studies. And that has a big impact on our ability to test drugs. So the A4 study that Mike mentioned took 4.5 years to recruit those 1,169 individuals. Even the aducanumab study, you saw those dramatic pictures where we were able to demonstrate the removal of amyloid from the brain. Even the aducanumab study, when it went to phase 3, took 3 years to recruit. So that means that we can't answer those scientific questions sometimes for 8 years or 10 years from when we start the study, and it just slows everything down. So recruitment is a big challenge. Our participants are not representative of the US population. We know that the majority of participants that take part in trials are Caucasian, at least in the US, which means that we don't know how effective that drug really is in everybody, right? And that's really important for issues like safety. We want to know that the drugs that are being tested are safe for everybody. So that means that people that take part in studies need to represent our population. The studies for Alzheimer's disease are really complex and lengthy. So as Mike mentioned, we do PET scans, there's blood samples, there's long, laborious cognitive tests. So it's tough on people, and it's tough on them during a time where they're dealing with disease. They're dealing with the burden of that on their family and their care partners. So that's a big challenge for us as well. We also need to follow people for a long time, and that's asking a lot of people. We have a limited trained workforce. There's just a finite number of people like Mike that have studied neuroscience or neurology, and there's even less people that have experience running clinical trials. So that's another limitation and challenge that we're working to address. And then more broadly, the Alzheimer's Association has really pointed out that there's a real issue with underdiagnosis. So people aren't told whether they have dementia. If they are told they have dementia, they're not told if it's likely due to Alzheimer's or something else. So if you don't know that you have Alzheimer's, then you don't know that there could be a study that you could participate in. So that's another issue that we really need to work on. And also underlying all of this is this ongoing stigma, right? If you have Alzheimer's, if you're told you have dementia, and if you tell people that you are treated differently. And that affects all of this. It affects people's willingness to talk about their diagnosis, and it could be impacting their willingness to take part in a research study. Okay, so those are the challenges. But as I said, researchers are optimistic, and we have ways of dealing with these things. And the thing I'm most excited about is our Research Participant Advisory Board. So I'm excited to talk to you now about how we're integrating feedback from participants to make clinical trials better. Okay, so this is a Venn diagram meant to illustrate the context that clinical trials are happening in. So on the outside is everyone else, right? And then smaller circle of that are people taking part in research, which we know is about 1% of the people that could be doing studies. The smaller circle there is the scientific community. And then even smaller than that are the clinical sites that are actually conducting the trials locally in your community. The even smaller group are the people like Mike and I that are working to design studies and put them together and run them. Well, for a number of years, the input from research participants really had to trickle through these layers of the scientific community and the clinical sites to get to people like Mike and I that are putting together the studies. And what we realized is we really needed direct interaction. We wanted to be able to ask questions about our studies propose ideas to our participants or people like the participants we're trying to recruit, and get that feedback up front so that when we put studies together, it makes sense and it's feasible. So that's what this research participant advisory board is meant to do. And this is an amazing group of people. We just put it together last year. We're very lucky that we were able to meet last February before COVID really hit the US. So this is the group. We have 14 members. They're pretty diverse. We have some racial and ethnic diversity, but they're also diverse in terms of their disease experience. There's folks that are taking part that have a genetic mutation, so they know that they have elevated risk to develop dementia. And there's people on the board that even have early signs of cognitive impairment. And then we also have folks on the board that are care partners. So in our first meeting, we talked in general about research and what we could do to make it better. The next 2 quarterly meetings, we really focused on the AHEAD study that Mike talked about, which is a preclinical study. So these are people that have no cognitive impairment, but they do have amyloid in their brains. So we proposed what the study's design would look like, and we talked to them about our recruitment approach, and we got feedback from our board on how to make that better. In the 4th quarter, we talked about COVID because, of course, everybody's talking about COVID, and COVID had a big impact on Alzheimer's disease research. We really wanted to understand how can our researchers navigate this space, because we are continuing to do research even in this COVID landscape. We also had some conversations, more conversations about the disclosure of research and clinical results. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of key findings and ways that we were able to improve studies right away as soon as we got this feedback. Again, because we are integrated with our study team, and this advisory board is integrated with our study team. So the number one point that they made, and this was before COVID, was move studies from the clinic to the community. A lot of our academic research centers are many hours drive from where people live. So we need to make research more accessible. We need to make it more accessible to more people. People shouldn't have to take a day off work to take part in a research study. So this is something that we're working on. Because of COVID, a number of our studies have adjusted and are using more remote methods of collecting information from people for research. But I still think we have a long way to go in this space. So that was one point. The others were really around sharing of results. When you're taking part in a research study, you want to know, like, what difference am I making? How is my contribution impacting the field? What are you learning from the study that I'm a part of? So summarizing study results on a regular basis and sharing that with participants is important to do. But on a personal level, people really want to know about their own results. You know, I would like to see my amyloid scan. Even if you can't tell me what that means for me clinically, having transparency around that, sharing your results is really important to participants. So some adjustments we were able to make to the AHEAD study as a result of the feedback was we added an option to disclose the genetic results that were being done as part of the screening process. It's optional, it's not required. Not everybody wants to know that or is ready to have that information, especially when you don't have cognitive symptoms. But it does potentially change how you're calculating your risk, and it could affect your planning for the future. So people wanted to have the option. We also are now separately reimbursing for time for the study partner. So each of our studies requires not just the person that's volunteering to do the research, but another person that serves just as an informant, just to confirm whether there's been cognitive changes, right? Because if it's cognitive changes, people don't always have the insight, don't always recognize that their memory or their cognition is being impacted. So these study partners are a really important part of the research process. They should be reimbursed for their time. We also made some adjustments to the language on the consent and study guide. I forgot to start my timer, so let me check my time. Okay, I need to talk faster. With COVID, I think the main thing I want to highlight here is that communication is really critical. Everyone's got a different level of comfort coming into a research clinic. It may depend on the level of disease in your local community. It may be dependent on your own risk for COVID, whether you've been vaccinated or not. So the feedback we got really is to communicate with your participants, communicate upfront with anybody who's potentially going to take part in your research study. Make sure you share all that information upfront so that people can prepare and know that they're going to be taken care of during that research visit. Finally, I think the take-home message from our research participant advisory board really is best reflected in their own words. So do not underestimate the participants and their care partners. Don't underestimate the knowledge base they have. Anyone that's researching the disease has done some research before they join a study. Don't underestimate their ability to grasp new information when you share it. Don't underestimate their past experiences with medical testing, and don't underestimate their ability to decide whether they want information. All right, I want to turn now to the opportunity or the improvement that we're trying to make with clinical trials by making them more accessible and going remote. So we know the internet is here to stay, and these registries have all really harnessed the potential of the internet to collect interest from people on clinical trials. So these are different websites where you can go to get more information about Alzheimer's disease, where you can learn, for example, the healthybrains.org talks about the 6 pillars of brain health. There's a lot of educational information there. And then each of them provide referrals over to clinical trials. But our group at ATRI wanted to take that a step further. And rather than just collecting names and referring people to studies, we wanted to be able to understand, can we actually do some online testing that will help us understand who's at elevated risk, who's likely to be eligible for studies, and then build a trial-ready cohort so that these people can then quickly enroll into studies. The real aim of this program, it's called TrackPad, which is Trial-Ready Cohort for the Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia. The aim was to really accelerate recruitment into clinical trials. So Mike talked about the A4 study. I told you it took 4.5 years to enroll. It took a long time to enroll because we were looking for people who have normal cognition, over the age of 65, but have a certain level of amyloid in their brain. So 70% of the people that came in for that study were not eligible. They didn't have amyloid in their brain, which was good news for them. But in terms of recruiting for research, we had to screen a lot of people. So the aim of Trial Ready Cohort is to build up this cohort and then rapidly put them into studies as they become available. So this is a complex flow, but it basically summarizes what we're trying to accomplish. And the program has been funded now for 3 years, and we've built out the full platform, and we're just really in the beginning stages of starting to refer people to clinical trials. So I'll just briefly share the way we did this is we reached out to people that were already signed up on these registries that I shared before, the Alzheimer's Prevention Registry, Brain Health Registry, and Trial Match. They were sent an email that invited them to join the APT web study. And a lot of them did. As Mike mentioned, we're almost at 40,000 people that have consented now to the APT web study. The APT web study has quarterly unsupervised visits that includes the Cognitive Function Index, or CFI, and CogState testing. So then our biostatisticians run some algorithms, try to understand who could potentially be eligible for studies. They're referred to sites. The sites send emails to reach out to these folks and say, hey, we'd love to invite you into the clinic. When they agree to come to the clinic, they have genetic testing and memory testing, which is a little more involved than what you're doing online on the computer. And if you continue to be eligible, then people are invited to have a PET scan or an LP scan so that we can understand if you've got sufficient levels of amyloid where you might be eligible for a study. If you meet those requirements, then we put people into this trial-ready cohort. They're followed every 6 months just to make sure we have current data on them about their eligibility. And then as soon as a study becomes available, we make sure they know about it and they're invited to join a study. So again, this is the APT web study that Mike showed earlier. And what's in it for you? Well, you have secure, personalized web-based tools. You can assess and track your cognitive performance. You have the opportunity to receive a comprehensive evaluation at one of our expert nationwide clinical sites and potentially take part in clinical trials. The web study has had a great enrollment. We got some good spread across the United States. This is a map that shows the number of people by county. So you can see in dark blue, the counties where we have between 450 and 1,600 participants. So those are, we've got Orange County, LA County, and San Diego County, of course, Maricopa County in Arizona, Cook County in Illinois, as well as others. And many of these places are places where we have research centers. This is just a little bit more data of who's come into the ABT web study so far. As Mike mentioned, we're almost to 40,000 consented to the study with a mean age of 64. And just a reminder, it's anybody over 50 is welcome to join, but we are getting more older people. We are getting a majority of women, so 73% are women. And unfortunately, we have not accomplished diversity in this web study. We're 91% Caucasian. So we're really focusing in future campaigns and recruitment and outreach to communities, to those underrepresented groups, so that we can ensure that we have a representative sample that are available for trials. Okay, so here's my pitch. If anybody is on this webinar and is interested in learning more, I've included the website for both the APT web study and the AHEAD study that Mike talked about a little bit more. For the APT web study, we're just looking for anybody who's healthy, over 50, has not been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and is interested in participating in clinical trials. And just a reminder, you're not guaranteed to be invited to come in for a clinical trial. The invitations go to people that are within a couple hundred miles of a research center, and then based on your cognitive testing scores. So you're still contributing to research. You're still a huge part of us learning more about what is normal aging. So please, sign up if you're over 50. We'd love to have you take part. For the AHEAD study, this is testing and intervention meant to delay the development of dementia in people who have a certain level of amyloid in their brain. So we're looking for people who are ages 55 to 80. I think in order to be in the study, Mike will correct me when we open this up for discussion. If you're below 60, you do need to have some family history in order to qualify for screening. So you can't have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. You do need to have somebody who can be a study partner for you. So a close friend, a relative, even a neighbor, somebody who's willing to kind of be that second person at the study visits, and those can be done by phone as well. And then as part of the study, you would find out if you have elevated or intermediate levels of amyloid in your brain. So you have to be interested and willing enough that you'd want to know that information. That's something to think about before signing the consent form. So as I mentioned, we're working to continue to seek input from our research participants. We're continuing to recruit to the ABT web study, the AHEAD study. We are focused on improving diversity in particular. I want to thank the ACTC Research Participant Advisory Board. They're an incredible group of people. They've given a lot of their time, and it's so valuable to hear their voice directly to our study organizers. I also want to thank the TrackPad platform participants, people taking part in the APT web study, their families. Our work is funded by the NIA. This grant number here is for the TrackPad program. This is our study team, and these are our study sites and collaborators and data safety monitoring board. Thank you, Kensington Senior Living, for the opportunity to share our work. I'm very grateful to be here today.
Well, we are grateful for all that great information. It's amazing how many resources are actually out there. And Dr. Raffi, I invite you to join us as we get into the Q&A part of the presentation. Let me just start with you, Sarah. You did mention COVID, and one of our questions is, I had my first COVID-19 vaccine dose. Can I still take part in research studies? Is there some risk?
I'm going to punt that to Mike because that's the kind of question he answers every day.
Okay.
Yeah, getting the COVID vaccine does not negatively impact your ability to participate in our trials. We certainly make sure that we're aware of when you get the vaccine, but it does not prohibit you from participating.
Okay, we have another question. It's you did mention that Sarah, that you need a partner for some of these studies. This question says, I live on my own. I don't think I have someone that could serve as my study partner. Can I still help with research?
So absolutely, you can definitely still help with research. If you are willing to volunteer or speak with a neighbor or friend, they can also serve as a study partner. It doesn't have to be a family member. But some people prefer to keep all that information more private. So there are other studies that you can take part in that don't require a study partner. So there's lots of options available, and I encourage you to check them out. And I meant to offer, Sandra, that if people have questions, that I'm happy to answer those as well by email.
Fantastic. Good to know. Dr. Raffi, this is a question for you. A lot of excitement about some of the new treatments you were talking about in your presentation. For the new immunotherapies, would the person take these for the rest of their lives, or is it limited to just a couple of years? That's the question.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the actual immunotherapy. More than likely, you will be required to take the medication until the amyloid is removed from the brain, and then perhaps have further treatments as needed to make sure that the levels stay low. But the FDA, when they do approve a drug, would give the indication of how long you would have to take it.
And those slides that you shared with us just a short time ago that showed basically the disappearance of those amyloid proteins after treatment with this new drug were pretty remarkable. So would that suggest that the cognitive symptoms would go away as the amyloid proteins disappear?
That's a great question. We believe that the amyloid develops in the brain and subsequently there is cognitive changes. So it is possible that in someone who is in a preclinical or asymptomatic stage, that by being on these medications, you could delay the onset of their symptoms by 5 or 10 years. And clearing out the amyloid should reduce the risk of developing symptoms down the road. However, if you have symptoms presently and you are started on the medication, it does not look like it will reverse any of the injury that has taken place.
All the more reason why people who are healthy and asymptomatic, it really is beneficial to enter a study, right, Sarah? And yet it's so darn scary. I mean, who wants to know that they have this stuff growing in their brain and they're asymptomatic? That's scary.
Yeah, exactly. It is scary. There have been researchers that are doing some wonderful work, more qualitative work, really talking to people about what it means for them and why did they choose to learn this information. And those studies really reveal that people take this information, they assimilate it, and then they really use it to plan their lives. So in many ways, the information can empower you to really make the best choices for yourself in the short term. So yeah, it is very much an individual choice, but definitely hope that people wouldn't, out of fear, not really explore those and at least have a conversation with a researcher about what it would mean to take part in a study. What information would you have to learn? What don't you want to learn? Just engage in the conversation, and our researchers are always happy to talk about that.
All right, we have I want to get these two questions in before we toss things back to Robert. Somebody says, I'd like to help with research, but I'm not sure I want to take experimental medication. Is there some other way that I can contribute without taking experimental drugs? Who would like to
I'll
tackle
take
that
this
one?
one, and then I saw another one that I think Mike should take on ApoE.
Yes, I'm closing out with that.
There are so many studies that you can take part in without taking an experimental medication. And scientists really need help from people who are willing. There's exercise studies, there's studies that look at diet, there's studies that just do memory tests. So definitely, if you're interested in helping with research, we really encourage you to reach out. And there are lots of studies that don't involve taking a medication.
Okay, final question for Dr. Raffi. Through Gene Match, I've heard about APOE gene. You did not mention it in your work. What role does this gene play?
So the number one risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease is age, okay? The second most important risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease is having the ApoE4 genotype. So just very quickly, ApoE is a protein that our body has in the brain, and it circulates freely, and it actually is involved in removing amyloid out of the brain. And individuals anybody can inherit one copy from their mother and one copy from their father. And ApoE comes in different forms. And it turns out that if you inherit 2 copies of ApoE4, this is the ApoE4 version, you're 10 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And it is thought it's because the ApoE4 protein is very inefficient at removing amyloid out of the brain. If you have 1 copy of ApoE4, then you are 8 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And if you don't have any copies of ApoE4, then you do not have an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease other than the general population that's based on your age. So it is a risk factor, but it is not a guarantee. So someone could have ApoE4, 2 copies, and not develop Alzheimer's dementia, but it is a risk factor. And we do not recommend testing for it or trying to identify your genotype because it simply is a risk. It is not something that we can modify or target at this time.
Right. Such great information, Dr. Michael Raffi, Sarah Walter, thank you so much for sharing. And Robert, I know you want to close things out now.
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you to all our participants this afternoon that have attended this extraordinary webinar. Dr. Raffi and Sarah Walters, we greatly appreciate you providing us with a wealth of fascinating and topical information. And of course, Sandra, for you moderating and posting important questions that we need to be conscious of. Thank you for all of your effort at the Alzheimer's Therapeutic Research Institute. Your dedication and passionate commitment to providing knowledge and supporting Alzheimer research initiatives is extraordinary. We at the Kensington, at Sierra Madre, and at Redondo Beach provide vital memory care solutions for families and are honored to partner with this profound initiative and USC. We will support this important research with a $2,000 donation match. And information on matching funds for all of you who have attended will be provided to you via an email after this event. So all of you, thank you for attending and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.